from Norway and Switzerland too. Here you can see quite clearly when the crisis happened, and it was largely a crisis of asylum. But I would caution you that we should be very clear that we don't always talk about the same groups. So when Isabella talks about arrivals, that does not necessarily mean that all of the people arriving are asylum seekers, and it doesn't mean that all asylum seekers are people who arrive by illegally crossing a border. They can be quite separate groups. However, during the crisis, so at the end of 2015, a big peak there when we were having something like 180,000 asylum seekers per month, indeed, almost everybody who was arriving illegally, making an illegal border crossing, to use Frontex terminology, but they were also, almost all of them, asylum seekers. So the two groups were actually the same during the crisis. But since then, and before then, they can be quite different groups. So we need to be clear when we talk about what we're talking, when we're talking about asylum compared to people arriving in an irregular manner at the external borders of the EU. So you can see also from this line graph at the top that now in the last year, 2017, basically we've gone back down to a level which was last seen in 2014. So we've gone back to sort of pre-crisis levels, and we're now running at about 60 or 70,000 applications for asylum made per month in the whole of the EU+. Here again, a word of caution, when I talk about applications, I mean the actual application. I'm not talking about the people who are applying. So there can be people who make more than one application. Okay? So these numbers are somewhat inflated if you're thinking about the number of people, the actual asylum seekers making the applications. Talking about just this year, so far this year, we have data until the 18th of March, so quite recent, we've had about 125,000 applications for asylum. That's more or less 10 or 11,000 per week. So the level is still relatively constant, so very similar to what it was last year. A third of all of the applications were from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan or Nigeria. That's quite different to during the crisis when 2/3 of all of the applications were made were just from three countries, Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan. So in recent months and last year, the composition of the flow of asylum seekers is really changing and it's expanding. So there are many more countries producing asylum seekers who then come and apply in Europe. The European member states are keeping up with the flow quite well. They are making about 60,000 decisions per month. And now we're at the level where only about 1/3 of all of the decisions made are positive. So 2/3 of the decisions which are being made currently result in a negative decision. So the person is denied asylum. Whereas during the crisis, when, as I said, almost all of those arriving were Syrians, Iraqis and Afghanis, the recognition rate went up to something like 60%. But now we're back down to about 1/3. And final fact, overall, we are also making progress in reducing the backlog. Of course, with millions of people arriving in quite a short space of time, there was a big backlog of cases, well over 1 million in 2016. Now that number has been reduced to about 500,000. Here you can see, by looking at the big circles, those are the major flows to the European Union. At the bottom you have the top 30 countries of origin, and on the side you have all of the member states. I won't go into this in detail, but just suffice it to say you can see most, the member states taking most applications were France, Germany, Greece, Italy, and to some extent the United Kingdom, and the largest numbers of applications were being made by Syrians, Nigerians, Iraqis and Afghanis, as I said before. If we look at the beginning of this year, this is basically the same thing but shown in a different way. It depends on your brain which one you understand best. I happen to like this one best. You can see what proportion of the overall flow Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan and Nigeria represent. I said 1 in 3, But if you look at the rest of the donut, you can see just how many other countries there are, and really they're from all over the world. So there's plenty from Africa, there's plenty from the rest of Asia, there's even Venezuela there now. So it really has diversified the flow over the past year. And as you can see from the bottom right donut, only about 5 or 6 member states are dealing with well over 2/3 of all of the asylum applications being made in the EU. Of course, not all asylum seekers are equal. There are different recognition rates for each country of origin. So you can see from this graph the big circles. On the left, we have the recognition rate. So the top right circle there is up at the level of 100%, and that's for Syrians. So basically, almost every Syrian who applies is given asylum. If you look at the bottom left of the graph, you can see a big circle down there. Those are Afghans, and you can see that the recognition rate is much lower, around about 20%, 25% on average. And there are other countries with different recognition rates in between. The length of the line is how different the recognition rate is in each member state. So with complicated countries like Afghanistan, you will have a long line because there will be some member states giving high recognition rates and some giving low recognition rates for the same country of origin. But where the line is very short, so for instance with Albania, there, the red color, you can see that almost all member states agree that the recognition rate for Albanians is very low, below 10%. That can be for various reasons. It can be different decision practices, but it can also be that they have different types of Albanians or different types of Syrians applying in certain member states. This is just to represent the number of pending cases which are remaining now in the EU. The lighter color at the bottom is the proportion of pending cases which have been waiting for a decision for longer than 6 months. And that is the legal limit, according to EU law, that all asylum applications should get a decision before 6 months. But as you can see from this graph, around about half of them at the moment are not. So that's more or less the situation in the EU plus as regards asylum. What do we do? What does EASO do? Basically, we do 3 things. We do information and analysis, so we gather these statistics and we show them at conferences like this. The stuff is also available, of course, on our website. We do training, and we do a number of investigations into best practices, into standards, etc., and we publish those on our website too. And of course, like Frontex, we do operations, usually in hotspots. In regard to the operations, currently we're present in Greece and Italy, of course, in the hotspots, but also in the capitals. And we're also, in a much smaller way, present in Bulgaria and Cyprus, where we work on things like reception, and on backlog management. In the hotspots in Italy and Greece, we were very much concerned with the relocation scheme, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, and which was, for a while, rather contentious. That's now all finished. And we are there now dealing rather with, in Greece, admissibility procedures on the islands, and in Italy with registration, helping the Italians register applicants for asylum. Those are the figures for relocation. 33,000 relocated overall, and there's only about 1,000 or 2,000 people left to be relocated to other member states before the scheme really comes to an end. As Isabella was saying, we too have had our there's been a proposal by the Commission to radically revise our regulation in order to expand our mandate and strengthen our work. So we too are now waiting for that to be passed and to come into force. And when that happens, we will have expanded current roles, but we will also have new tasks. The major new tasks that we will have will be, in particular, monitoring member states' asylum systems to see, if they're working as they should. Basically, we will be monitoring each member state every 5 years, very much in depth. We're currently planning now how we will do that. We will be much more involved in producing operational standards that member states need to live up to in various aspects of the asylum system. We will be providing guidance on how member states should deal with asylum seekers from basically every country of origin and every safe third country. We will also have emergency pools of asylum experts from member states. So our pool is smaller, it's only 500 people, but those will be immediately deployable should there be a crisis in the future. And we are waiting to see if the proposed permanent relocation scheme under Dublin is actually passed, it goes into law, and if it does, then we will be charged with managing it. This is currently where the SEAS is at in terms of, as you know, the Common European Asylum System consists of these pieces of legislation. All of them have been proposed for changes, major changes by the Commission. This is more or less where we're at. It may be that I'm a little bit behind the times, but more or less we are here. As you can see, we put our own regulation at the top of the list, of course. So the proposed EU Agency for Asylum, we won't be EASO anymore, we will be the EU Agency for Asylum, is up there in trilogue, and we're hoping that it will be adopted towards the end of June. But unfortunately now, apparently, this is going to be linked to progress on the Dublin proposal, which is much more contentious, and therefore we are unsure as to whether this will actually happen by June or not, and whether we will be waiting several months more. That's it. If you have any questions on either the situation or the development of EASO, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know what, it works. So first of all, I would like to express gratitude to the Warsaw School of Economics for organizing this event, the second edition of EU Eumigro conference. And it's fantastic that the school asked us for our patronage, and we obviously granted it. Well, I feel that all the relevant data was already delivered, so I'm in a sort of vacuum. Nevertheless, just a few short opening remarks regarding the European Union and what it is, because the EU and its activities or inactivity was heavily referred to by previous speakers. In general, I would like to appeal to not treat the European Union as something different than the sum of its member states, because European Union equals member states. All decisions reached at the level of the Union are agreed in the European Union Council, and this political stimulus is also always given by the European Council. So it's not like the European Union is a sort of omnipotent behemoth looming over Europe and imposing this or that proposal without consent of its member states. So any decision taken at the European level is previously heavily discussed by its member states, and all these member states needs to agree that we go into that or this. So just to briefly open the what was done, what the European Union tasked itself in 2015 and previously when the migration crisis was growing. Certainly the European Commission and all other relevant European institutions didn't task itself with undoing the crisis, because it's impossible. The crisis, I do believe it's a sort of new reality we live in. The European Commission tasked itself with alleviating the situation first of all, in Greece and Italy. That is, to some degree, a reason why the Commission proposed aforementioned European agenda on migration. It consists several of crucial elements, and only one heavily discussed, especially in Poland, was relocation and resettlement schemes, which were also agreed on by all European member states in July and September 2015. As we all know, not every European member state, except that it agreed on following the schemes, decided to follow them afterwards. Poland, the Czech Republic and Hungary were among those countries which the European Commission had to refer to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, and it happened in December for not fulfilling its legally binding obligation to participate in relocation scheme. The scope of challenge in the context of relocation for these countries wasn't that tremendous, because as it was mentioned previously by Ms. Pamua in her presentation about the real picture of the migration crisis, the accepting of 7,000 refugee seekers is not a challenge at all when compared to numbers of refugee seekers staying currently in Lebanon, for example. Another point regarding the divisions in Europe. President Juncker always appealed to not treat Europe as Western Europe or Eastern Europe, to not create these divisions. Political developments in the European Union proved that any member state, regardless whether it joined the European community in the 50s or in 2004, is not immune to populism. We have strong populist movements in Germany, in Italy, and I do not believe that those countries were suddenly transferred from Western Europe to Eastern Europe. So populism is present in every European country, and in every European member state there are movements which perceive certain European action like relocation or resettlement as highly controversial. Where we are right now, the European Commission believes that it managed, in cooperation with its member states, with the European Union member states and other institutions, to alleviate the severity of the crisis. As I said, it's impossible to undo the crisis because there is no any entity in the world which could undo the climate change or bring to an end every military conflict, which is a pushing factor for migrants to seek refuge in the European Union. All these numbers that were presented here clearly say that the various European activities managed to bring down those huge numbers from 800,000 of new arrivals in Greece in 2015 to 34,000 in 2017. It's difficult to verify whether without the EU-Turkey statement that number wouldn't go up again, because we have the statement adopted and in action since 2016, and from our perspective it proved to be a solid element of that solution. But naturally there are other elements of European response which were already mentioned in the European agenda on migration, and they are also linked to that what happened in the relations with Turkey. This is cooperation with third countries, with neighboring countries, with neighboring geographical regions. Cooperation with Africa, which was it didn't start in Valletta in 2015, but the Valletta summit was an important step into setting up the European Trust Fund for Africa and other financial vehicles which were set up in order to support better governance in African countries, to increase investments in these countries, and one of these vehicles could be is the European External Investment Fund. So there is a lot of things going on in order to alleviate the migratory pressure on the European Union, and this is a task which is ahead of the European Commission and other European institutions. As the rest of the speakers, I'm obviously open to answer any questions you might have.
So thank you very much for all the speeches. Because we are a bit in a hurry, but still I think that the most important part is the one concerning the questions from the audience. I would like to offer like 5-6 minutes for 2-3 questions, brief ones from the audience concerning representatives of 4 institutions we have today. Are there any questions? Okay. Mogę poprosić? Włącz mikrofon, dobrze? Włącz mikrofon. Okay. So please.
Grzegorz Lindenberg, I have a question to both Ms. Pamua and Mr. Rysz concerning practical steps that either UNHCR or European Commission did to provide proper contribution of Saudi Arabia and other rich Arab countries into sheltering and financing Syrian refugees in 2015-2016. As far as I know, the financial contribution of these countries was almost zero, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia had state reserves of $750 billion and 3 million places in air-conditioned tents prepared for Hajj pilgrims available. Saudi Arabia is located 80 kilometers from Syria, a neighbors Jordan that houses 500,000 Syrian refugees. So were there any practical steps that the Commission and the UN organization did to make sure that these countries take Syrian refugees and pay for Syrian and other refugees? Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay. Professor Paweł Kaczmarczyk, Center of Migration Research, University of Warsaw, please.
In fact, I have 2 questions, if I may.
Okay, please.
The first one is to representatives of European Union, particularly to Ms. Cooper, because you showed to us those shocking pictures from 2015 mainly. But my question is, what about outcomes of recent actions taken by European agencies, including also Frontex? Because we know that the death toll is very high. Death rate is in fact much higher than it was below. So how you comment also the situation in Libya, the treatment of asylum seekers there, and the general assessment? What would be a general assessment of the efficiency of the actions taken recently, so in 2017 particularly? And the second question goes to Maria Pamua. It's about global compacts. And my question is, do we really need to separate compacts on migration and refugees? So from your perspective, what's the value added of having the separate global compact devoted exclusively to refugees?
Okay, so thank you very much. And I think that here we will stop with the questions. So could you please refer to the questions from the audience in a turn you prefer? Briefly, and then we will invite all of you for a short coffee break. So please, the floor is yours. So it's up to you to decide.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me? I've got strong. The search and rescue is a priority. I mean, if you look at the situation, throughout the years in 2015 and 16 and 17, the death toll remains high, but it's not higher because we have to look at the proportion of people arriving and people departing. I do not remember off the top of my head. In 2015, I believe it was 5,000. In the following year, 3,500. In 2016, I cannot remember off the top of my head the numbers for 2000.
Join us here.
Yeah. The Mediterranean Sea is 2.5 million square kilometers large. It is impossible to guarantee full safety of the sea. There is no amount of vessels that would be sufficient to provide full safety. And this is why it is, if you look at the fact that the smugglers operating in Libya put people on board, 170 people on board of a 10-meter long dinghy, where none of the migrants are given a life jacket. It takes seconds for a tragedy to occur. So what needs to be done is we need to fight the smuggling networks and prevent them from putting people in dangerous situations. And this is why what the European Commission is suggesting is to open legal channels which would allow the refugees to apply for asylum without having to rely on dangerous forms of transportations, without them having to finance these criminal networks, is really a priority. But here the solution clearly requires the commitment of the member states who would be willing to accept resettled refugees. And this is something that obviously me representing an operational agency is nothing I can really say beyond what I just said. It does require political commitment. In terms of saving lives, since the new regulation that I spoke about now explicitly mentions the role of Frontex in search and rescue operations. We do have this part explicitly mentioned in our mandate, but search and rescue, independently of whether it is part of your mandate or not, is an obligation of whoever is out at sea, whether it's a Coast Guard vessel, military vessel, private yacht, or a ferry boat. Search and rescue operations are coordinated by the national authorities which are responsible for a certain area of search and rescue waters, and it's them that take the decision who should go and rescue these people. Last year, vessels deployed by Frontex contributed to the rescue of 35,000 lives, and this is something we take extremely seriously and that we will take extremely seriously. So we cooperate with national authorities. But again, it is not just like what I said about border control. What happens at the border are the dramatic symptoms of a much bigger problem which has to be addressed at the root.
Addressing first of the questions regarding the Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, I have to admit I'm not the expert on the Middle East, so excuse my ignorance. But I've just checked because I had it somewhere on my email, and it, in fact, in October last year, UNHCR has signed an agreement with Saudi Arabia on assisting refugees and persons in need of protection. And on increased cooperation, so that the first sign would be the assistance of more than 500,000 Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh that would be supported by Saudi Arabia. Besides that, according to the numbers I got, Saudi Arabia at the current moment are hosting more than 500,000 Yemeni refugees, 260,000 Syrian refugees, and 300,000 Burmese. There is a question if those are refugees or not, because the Saudi Arabia are not treating them as refugees per se, according to Geneva Convention. They are treating them as the persons in a particular vulnerable situation, but not call them refugees. That's the issue. But I understand that the cooperation agreement has been signed recently, and that will be trying also to pursue the change of the attitude in that part of the world towards assisting refugees. When it comes to the global compact, I think it's for the more clever minds than mine to decide. And yes, do we need 2 global compacts? I think that yes and no. I mean, the migration is an overall issue, and the refugees are migrants too. I mean, forced migrants. But they're in a particular vulnerable situation that they need much more support and much more assistance to become self-reliant, I believe. And then the assistance toward refugees, it should be somehow more targeted towards better integration solutions, but also better protection solutions. Steering migration is not an easy issue, and I particularly like the phrase mixed migration. It's always mixed migration. You even have refugees who are not, I mean, in my view, 100% refugees. Some of the reasons to fly were at some point maybe, I don't know, influenced by the migration factors, like moving from one European country to another to search for a better job or to provide for better education opportunities. But still, those are people who are most vulnerable. and especially those who are in a particular vulnerable, out of the vulnerable. So for example, women with children or unaccompanied minors, they need specific assistance, and I'm very happy that we have 2 global compacts because that it shows the importance of that group, and I believe that I hope that it could be implemented in a proper way. Thank you.
Okay, so here we are. So we are just after our first session that we called Roundtable Debate. I hope that you enjoyed. It was a bit longer and a bit speedy, but still, if you are interested in our speakers' presentations or what they've said, please remember everything will be registered and published on the website. Also, we have time during the coffee break. Because we are a bit in a hurry, let's say that we will meet here 12, just so instead of 30 minutes, 25, and we will move to the second panel that will be moderated by Professor Paweł Kaczmarczyk. So now time is yours. Thank you. Dobrze. Dobrze, tak.
No jednak tak. Nie wiem, czy możemy kogoś spytać, jeżeli chcesz tutaj drugą. Tak?
Dobra, jak 13:30. Słuchaj, do 13. Się uprzemy do 13:30. Max 13:40.
Zobaczymy, jak będzie.
Max 13:40. Dobrze, ja pani profesor będę polowuję. To co zrób teraz krótkie...
Ja to będę bardzo krótko mówić, możesz się już próbować zajmować.
Tak.
Słuchajcie,
Już nie będzie. Nie, już koniec, dawaj. To teraz jak będziesz powiedział, jak ja z tego mogę wyjść. Możecie mi pomóc, bo nie wiem, co zrobiłam. Jak to zamknąć?
A to?
Okej, siadajcie. Przy studenta. Weź się zwin. Nie, siedź. Ty, kochany, to ty robisz prowadzenie, a ja potem odpalam, albo tu, ja potem odpalam sprzęt.
ladies and gentlemen, it's time to start second session. Having already a broad picture, right now we turn into details of the story and we'll devote the session particularly to discussion on migration management, if any, and we'll discuss it on various levels from pan-national, supranational to local or regional level, and also with regard to various groups of immigrants. And I'm really happy to have 5 fantastic speakers for the session, but 4 are present here. Unfortunately, Olaf Kleist was not able to join us here in Warsaw, but hopefully he will join us soon virtually. Olaf Kleist is a member and researcher at the Institute for Migration Research and Intercultural Studies at the Universität Osnabrück. He is political scientist specializing in forced migration, refugee and asylum policies, not only in Germany but also in Europe, and also in integration policies. So the idea for the panel is following. Every speaker will have around 15 minutes, and then we'll have joint discussion to follow after all of this presentation. And right now we start with Olaf. In this case, and sorry for that, there will be no discussion as Olaf is not able to hear us. However, feel free to send questions directly to him. So we go.
Let's see. Hello. Yeah, I hope you can see and hear me. Well, thank you very much. I'm just assuming everybody can see and hear me. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk to you via Skype, which I'm really sorry to do this over the distance. I would have really loved to come and meet everybody and take part in this really exciting conference. Thanks, Marta, so much for inviting me, for organizing all of this. You might still hear my voice a little bit. I didn't feel that well, so I'm really glad I can contribute a little bit over the distance. Let me try to bring you my give you my screen, my presentation. Let's see if that works. So here we go. What I want to talk about is resettlement. We were talking about some of the responses, the EU response to the refugee crisis. What I think is that resettlement is one of the crucial instruments that is used by the EU, reused, rethought, recreated by the EU now in response to the EU refugee crisis. And what I want to do is look a bit at the history, at what this actually is, what resettlement is, to have a bit of a bigger understanding of that, to see what's happening here right now, and then to see how we can maybe reconsider resettlement or safe pathways, as I would call it, to better respond to the challenges ahead. So first of all, the question then is, what is resettlement at all? And what the question is not that easily answered, because there are some different interpretations. We kind of use it for different things at the moment. In general, it's an umbrella term for all safe pathways for refugees. But in a more specific way, it actually means the UNHCR protection instrument, one of basically 3 durable solutions. So which is focused then on the most vulnerable refugees, a very specific set of refugees. At the moment, about 1.2 million people worldwide who are considered specifically vulnerable, even though they're already in a country of refuge, but can't find protection there. It is administered by UNHCR, but in cooperation with resettlement states. That means resettlement states take part in considering from which countries to resettle, and also which refugees to take in. So it is a cooperation, of a transnational cooperation that is done here on a global level. So what I want to talk about here, though, is not just the specific UNHCR program, but about safe pathways in general. What are safe pathways? So let's look at the history, because resettlement and safe pathways are actually about 100 years old, so a rather new instrument within the overall refugee policies, which has existed for centuries. And the first people being resettled internationally were Russian and Armenian refugees from southeastern Europe, about 220,000 in the interwar period, specifically by the International Labour Organization. Another 1 million European refugees were resettled after the Second World War, again, mostly to the US, Canada, Australia. And what is specific about these refugees is that they left Europe as refugees, but mostly arrived in countries of protection as labor migrants, often then active in infrastructure processes. So it was actually part of a often more general, greater migration programs for the resettlement states. Resettlement then in the Cold War kind of changed. We had a resettlement for Hungarian refugees later in the later 60s, also from Uganda and Chile. And this was more set within a political sphere of a political program to resettle refugees fleeing from specific political situations. And what we saw here were some kind of a global cooperation to solve refugee crises. So for Hungarian refugees, specifically people who fled to Austria and Yugoslavia, and then were distributed globally by UNHCR. Similarly, in the 1980s and 1990s for Vietnamese refugees, about 2 million Vietnamese refugees were resettled globally to over 120, over 140 countries at that time through different programs, but specifically and most prominently through the Comprehensive Plan of Action, the CPA, a global compact that allowed the resettlement of these refugees to many countries and resolve the refugee crisis in the region. That was a really successful, one of the most successful refugee policy programs that were ever organized, as it really solved the situation. But as this program wound down in the 1990s, resettlement was basically considered to be dead. The 1990s were the decade of return. Resettlement was considered completely irrelevant, but at exactly that moment, UNHCR published its first resettlement handbook. It introduced the resettlement program, as we know, a resettlement program for very few but the most vulnerable refugees. Ever since, UNHCR also tried to use resettlement as a strategic policy tool for global responsibility sharing, but mostly rather without success. So what we can see is that over time, resettlement and safe pathways really changed and transformed their meaning, what it actually meant, what it was, who it was for, and why it was used. And it shows the many facets and facets of resettlement and safe pathways. And I think this is something that we really need to keep in mind when we talk about resettlement today, or when we talk about safe pathways today, is that it actually encompasses a wide variety of policy instruments and tools. So what then were safe pathways in the refugee crisis? And these safe pathways came to bear on the refugee crisis again and again over the recent years. Of course, there was always refugee resettlement by UNHCR, but in the first years it was hardly used for Syrian refugees. And the first safe pathways that were meaningfully used for Syrians was the humanitarian admissions program that was introduced by Germany in 2013. It was a program that didn't necessarily focus so much on vulnerability, but specifically to the end also on connections to Germany, specifically family connections, relatives, or people who lived in Germany. So a very different kind of normative setting that was used here. And it was a really new program that hadn't existed before. So there was a humanitarian program in 2013. In 2014, there was a suggestion to recreate something like the Comprehensive Plan of Action, the way it was used for Vietnamese refugees, but this time for Syrian refugees. There was a suggestion made by François Crépeau, the UN Special Rapporteur for the Human Rights of Migrants, for example, also by Alexander Betz. Suggestions, however, that were never really picked up in the policy arena. But it was another way of trying to attempt to use safe pathways in the refugee crisis. 2015, then, there was again another idea of thinking about safe pathways in the relocation programs. That was a question of pathways within Europe to redistribute asylum seekers within Europe, 120, 160,000 people, which of course didn't really work out. Only a very small number were really relocated in Europe. And then in 2016, of course, we had the EU-Turkey deal, which had as a really innovative moment also safe pathways, a resettlement program that brought Syrian refugees from Turkey to Europe and in a kind of exchange program. I don't want to go into details here how successful this really was, but again, safe pathways played a crucial role in some policy innovations in the refugee crisis. So if you look at this development of the last few years, what kind of normative transformations can we see there? Now, when we think about the original norm of refugee resettlement by UNHCR, it really focused on refugee vulnerabilities. Though the HAP program was much more about humanitarianism, about domestic policies as well. Going on to the idea of responsibility sharing on a global level in the CPA, responsibility sharing in the EU, and to migration management in the EU-Turkey deal. So what we have here is a transformation, but also adding up different kinds of norms, policy norms, that were trying to be addressed through safe pathways by the European Union. And then the European Union in 2016 basically tried to capture all these developments in a new framework, the resettlement framework. Resettlement is not really new to the EU. Since about 2012, the EU Commission promotes resettlement safe pathways. There was this 2020 program, so 20,000 refugees to be resettled to the EU by 2020 on a yearly basis, which was basically abandoned. But 2016, the new framework tried to harmonize, to create a harmonization of resettlement within the EU, so that resettlement would still be a policy program by the EU member states, but under a harmonizing umbrella, a framework provided by the EU. That means there would be common procedures and status for refugees by all countries that participate in this framework. It would also mean a shared selection criteria from which third countries to resettle. And the main criteria that the EU suggests here, the EU Commission suggests, is to focus on those countries that actually cooperate with EU migration management. So basically to incentivize cooperation in border management and border protection mechanisms, and to give resettlement spaces for citizens and non-citizens in of those states that cooperate. That would also include much broader selection criteria than what we know from UNHCR. So rather than just looking at vulnerabilities, the EU also wants to add economic vulnerability as a criteria, family, social, cultural connections to resettlement states, similar to the HAP program. So the 1.2 million refugees that we already have worldwide who would qualify for resettlement under the UNHCR system would grow into the millions and millions of people who would actually fall into this framework by the EU. If you looked at it globally, of course, the EU only looks at very specific states that cooperate with its migration policies. And it also wants to use then a more broader range of instruments of safe pathways, including UNHCR resettlement, humanitarian admission programs, student work visas, etc. However, the EU does want to exclude specific cases, specifically those people who already tried to claim asylum on an irregular entry. So basically penalizing people who try to claim asylum and trying to prevent people from entering the EU irregularly. And it also would lower the protection status for people who come through this resettlement framework or safe pathways, who would only get temporary protection rather than the full refugee protection under UNHCR directive. So what the EU does here is it completely redefines what resettlement is. And this is why I'm really hesitant to even speak about resettlement here, rather about, let's talk about safe pathways. It makes it much broader. It gives it a much broader, includes many more people, many more tools, but makes it also much more vague, what it actually is. So I think we have a problem here because we don't really know what we're doing anymore. What the EU does basically is it tries to put everything into a bundle and throw this bundle at all problems it faces. It's basically taking the bath, sink and everything else and throws it at the problem. And I think that's not really fruitful. So let's try to rethink safe pathways. And what I think safe pathways really are is they are the Swiss knife of refugee policy. That means it is rather a small instrument. It's not for big operations, except maybe for CPAs, but in general, it only focuses on a small number of people. You won't usually get millions of people, only a few thousand per year. But it actually has very many functions. And you need to know which tool to use to which end. So you can't just take the whole Swiss knife and just throw it in somebody or just hit somebody with it. You need to know what tool you want to use for which norms and policy and you're trying to achieve. So look what you're going for and use the safe pathways that are appropriate. What are the policy goals and how can specific forms of safe pathways contribute to reaching that goal? So what I suggest then is differentiate between different tools and applications of safe pathways, refugee protection, domestic policy, migration management, and then investigate the best practices to actually guarantee the application. And when you do that, always consider do no harm principle. Let's not forget we are talking about refugees here, people who are vulnerable in every case, and their rights, their refugee rights, have to be upheld in every instance. And when these tools are implemented, always involve as many actors as possible, civil society, for example, by sponsorship, diasporas, refugees, bring them all into the development of these tools, into the application of these tools, but make sure it is known what kind of safe pathways are appropriate for which kinds of policy ends. and make sure we are talking about refugees. So that's my brief introduction to what I think resettlement actually means in the refugee crisis, what we can learn from it, and maybe how we can go, where we can go from here. The EU is redefining what safe pathways are, but I think we have to be much more careful what we are talking about and how we do it. All right, thank you very much for listening to me. I would love to be part of the conversation. I'm really sorry I'm missing all the other great papers, but I hope I'll meet all of you at some other opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, as I said already, Olaf is not able to hear us, but still he owes our applause, I guess. So I'm pretty sure there are many questions because it was a super interesting presentation as for beginning, but it leads us to the second now. This will be held by Professor Patrycja Matusz-Protasiewicz from University of Wrocław, from the Chair for European and Strategic Studies and from Institute of International Studies, in fact, Vice Dean of this institute, who is internationally acknowledged expert and migration scholar, specializing particularly in integration policies and migration management. So, floor is yours. We'll see.
Nie. Znaczy mogę mówić z innej, ale wolałabym ze swojej. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation, first of all. And Paweł, thank you very much for the warm words, but I know that you are a very strict moderator, so I have 12 minutes and I have to run. But before I start, I would like to say a few words about the previous presentations. I think after a rather pessimistic picture of the migration crisis and the management of the EU and national levels, I would like to go down to the city level and talk for a while about the new role of city level in multi-level governance of migration in the European Union. In my opinion, the migration crisis has strengthened the position of cities in the multi-level governance of migration. So please allow me to say a few words not only about the MLG model and the role of cities in this, but also please allow me to share with you some suggestions about the current developments on the city level in Poland. Because my recent project focus on institutionalization of integration policies in the Central Eastern European cities. Okay, we get used to talk about we get used to talk about integration policies, looking at it from the national level, analyzing diverse national models of integration. However, it is important to remember and say that today around 3/4 of EU citizens live in the cities. It means that cities play not only a crucial role in implementation of various policies, but also represent a very important level of management, and it goes to different and diverse public policies. The local administrations play an important role in implementing practical and, what is very more important, place-related programs and strategies aiming at social cohesion. In the model of MLG, in my opinion, very useful for the explanation of policy making in migration, the role of cities and its administration is strengthened by the EU level throughout different institutional arrangements, but also financial tools. In my opinion, the financial support of the EU level, and I mean European Integration Fund, previously now European Fund for Asylum, Migration and Integration. I don't know who came up with this name. The previous one was, in my opinion, much better. But I think the financial support from the EU level was very important and very crucial for strengthening the position of cities in creation of and development of own integration strategies. Maybe less influential in old member states, but very influential in for some pioneering programs in the Central, Eastern and European cities. Very often the cooperation of EU institutional level with the local level actors and institutions, both public and non-public actors, skip the national level, which we call in the MLG model the bypassing national, in this case national level. And it is not without purpose. In the recent years, the strategies and policies proposed by the national governments, it was mentioned before, were very restrictive, of the very restrictive nature, in the sense that the proposed arrangement aimed at mainly at reducing migration. At the same time, even in the time of refugee crisis in Europe, when the flow of migrants was relatively high, the cities level proposed less politicized solution, I would say more pragmatic solutions aiming at inclusive policy towards migrants. In case of cities integration policies, we are talking about multi-stakeholder governance, where both public and private actors are involved in development and implementation of programs in the area of housing, education, healthcare, or management of diversity. It is important to add that the negotiations, and it's important on the local level, between diverse multi-stakeholders occur not only on the horizontal level of the cities, but also on a vertical, more bottom-up perspective, engaging local, national, and European actors. While talking about growing role of cities in the multi-level governance of migration, it is important also to add the role of city networks as CLIP, Eurocities, Intercultural Cities, or European Coalition of Cities Against Racism as a collective actors in the policy making. Working through city networks or platform, as well as urban interest organizations, European founded project, or other ad hoc initiatives, all the initiatives really strengthen the exchange of good practices and policy learning process between cities. I've forgotten to go further with the presentation. Why you didn't help me? If we go to the city level, the shape of integration policy in the cities is of course determined by the number of factors, mainly the national context, including the legal competences of cities and of course the financial independence, but also depends strongly on national discourses on migration, which is very relevant for the current migration crisis. In the time of migration crisis, many cities acted against national level, offering welcoming programs or proactive integration policies. Of course, the general economic outlook of the cities and opportunities on the labor market can greatly influence the priorities local policymakers may set. In 2015 and 2016, in the peak of migrants' arrivals, cities were confronted not only with the urgency of integration policies, but also with the need of short-term crisis management. And I think it's very important, the cities were tested in their ability to coordinate their responses both, again, horizontally and vertically in order to cooperate with actors from other levels. In many cities, we have observed, from one hand, the spontaneous support, and you might know it from media, the spontaneous support and development of many voluntary initiatives, but on the other hand, growing wave of anti-immigrant sentiment. So it means that the cities were confronted in a kind of paradox between the very positive message sent by the civil society organizations and a very radical one sent by the supporters of anti-immigrant movement. And it was the way how to maneuver between both groups. Cities were also confronted with a new role in migration management, namely refugee reception, which was traditionally dominated by the national level. This active participation of cities in the management of migration crisis and the development of pre-departure integration measures has strengthened the city's new role in dialogue about the future migration policies. And I think this role of cities were strengthened, and the leadership of city mayors was also strengthened and pushed the leaders to send up the message that, hello, we cities want to be involved in not only implementation but also management of migration. As I previously said, in the case of EU cities, the need of development of local integration policy has been impacted firstly by the high diversity of local community and the need of diversity management. The cities develop very pragmatic solutions, and here I'm talking mainly about the old member states, at inclusive policy toward all citizens, and that's the difference from the national level. Programs that cities try to address their policies to all citizens without categorize them into known migration categories. If we talk about Poland, the situation, of course, looks a bit different. First of all, because the number of migrants is lower than in older member states, but on the other hand, because there is a lack of national integration policy. In the last 3 years, there were some programs developed on the local level in this. I'm going to talk about the city of Gdańsk and the city of Wrocław. I'm probably going to get some questions about Warsaw, but let's try to answer them. Yes, I'm going to finish. While talking about Central Eastern European cities and about Polish cities, first of all, there is a very dynamic inflow of labor workers, mainly from the neighboring countries. The economic development of these cities mentioned was very good, and what is very important, the unemployment is less than 3%, which means that the local labor market really needs migrants. And because of these socio-economic and also political processes, the cities decided to create their own integration strategies. On the one hand, they were confronted, as I said previously, with the welcoming programs developed by mainly by the NGO sector, and on the other hand, both, probably my own city, Wrocław, even more, were confronted with the very high anti-immigrant movement. However, both cities decided to create their own integration strategies. Gdańsk immigrants integration model adopted in 2016, and Wrocław very new strategy for multicultural dialogue 2018-2020. What is very important, both strategies were developed in cooperation with NGOs and migrants organizations, aiming at inclusion for all categories of migrants. Another thing that I have to add is the convergence between different local integration policies. I would say in the whole Europe. If I look at and in my previous projects, we analyzed 30 cities in Europe according to integration policies, and when I compare the local integration strategies, they have a lot of common. What is very interesting, the Polish two cases in some parts are copy-paste from the documents I already know, which is not wrong. But this is a visible convergence in the strategies. Only conclusions. This is the final slide, so I'm going to finish. I think the city's reaction to recent arrivals in migration shows that the multi-level settings of migration management are very important. Cities were confronted not only with the short-term management of arrivals, but also with pre-departure integration measures, which involve multi-level interactions and dynamics. What is more, on all levels of policymaking, increasingly involves non-public actors, NGOs, non-profile service providers, but also business and corporate interest groups, or, as I said, ad hoc organized social movements, as those refugee welcomes. The presence of many actors in the migration integration field on various levels of governance might, of course, be a challenge for a good governance. The other challenge might be the disconnected policy responses, the number of actors involved in the policy field, and of course the very diverse interest of the national and local level due to the specific competences. As I said, there are many EU-level institutions involved in strengthening the role of cities in the multi-level governance of migration. I'm very happy to hear that even the European Parliament, which is a lot slower than other institutions, decided to talk about the role of the cities in the institutional framework of the European Union, and the Constitutional Committee is working currently on resolutions about this subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So please keep your questions in mind, and without hesitation, we now move to the second presentation. Professor Anna Wiswizy, who is head of research at the Institute of East Central Europe in Poland, but first of all, assistant professor at DERI, the American College of Greece. Anna is political scientist and economist, and her research covers such areas as global safety, security, European integration, European politics, economy, and apparently also migration. So, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Dr. Pachocka, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be in my alma mater and to be able to speak on this issue, which is so important to all of us. I am an ardent photographer, so I always have pictures on my slides, but there's always a reason why I have them. So what you can see here is the Cape of Sunion, which is very close to Athens, and is this particular place where King Aegeus fell into the waters of what we know today as the Aegean Sea, because he thought that his son Theseus was actually killed while trying to win Minotaur in Crete. But it was not the case, so basically it's like a proper Greek tragedy. He died without necessarily having a good reason to do so. But what's the message here? There was a clear disjoint, a disconnect between the messages that the two parties to the story had. The son who didn't change the sails, and the father who thought that his son was dead. So when talking about migration, one of the questions that I always ask myself is, why is it so that what the politicians do and what we do in terms of actual solutions or ways of addressing the crisis we can do is so much different from what we hear in the media, and so much different from what the people say? And there are different kinds of stories that could be said, because there are those that are criticizing migration, that are all against the incoming population, but there are, of course, those players in the debate that are in favor of integrating those people and helping those in need. So the big question is, what is it that does not allow us to connect these two parties or these two sides to the debate? So these are the highlights of my brief presentation. Just have a brief look at this, but basically over the time that I've been dealing with migration, and because I live in Athens, I've had this first-hand insight into how it looks, what is at stake, how people suffer, what could be done. The first observation that I had is that when it comes to debate and academic research on migration, at first the question of what is actually at stake has not been addressed. Then we have fallen into this big discussion of what is there at stake in terms of concepts that we use and if we are talking about the same. Then we have seen a very strong inroad into the debate on migration from diverse disciplines which were not originally associated with migration research. But at the end of the day, today, 2018, where migration is still there, it is a phenomenon that we cannot just forget about. The big question is, what will we do? So this is the outline. I would like to look what is the ideal type solution, that is the link between the debate on migration and the policy-making process. And then I want to confront it with what is actually happening. Then I want to see which policy responses and to which avail. Then I want to apply the level of analysis approach to see what could be done and where is it that particular attention should be paid to. And this takes me very closely to to the previous speaker argument, which is exactly all about the cities, one of the research focus that I deal with. So this is one of these graphs that I have. As you can see, what I try to do here is just to show you that we have a one-off event or a process, it being migration, and it's addressed from two perspectives concurrently, because we have what people say, what people think, and what the politicians actually try to do. And the ideal type basically says that if there is an overlap or a mirror image between what we see in the upper row and in the lower row, then basically we can come up to a workable, very efficient policy solutions. For instance, look at this. If there is a connection between the essence of the crisis and how the crisis is represented, this is a good thing. If earnest analysis is also based on proper interpretation of things, which is not biased, then we have also a very good solution at hand. If the identification of risks, challenges, threats, and opportunities is somehow matched with what people feel, how they see the environment that they live in, we also have a potentially good outcome. If you apply the level of analysis to this issue, and you also are then able to see that the perception of reality that people on the ground have, that this also match, you are on a good way to have a policy solution that will work. And then if action proposed match those concerns and observations from the ground, you might come up with a good solution. But what happens if there is no match between those concepts? Of course, the situation becomes much more complex. And the particular problem that I have, of course, we could draw each story separately. The particular problem that I see is that if there is a disjoint at each of these levels, we will come up basically, or the process will end up either in the situation where there is no policy response, or a delayed policy response, or misguided policy response. If you look at the developments in Europe, we've basically had all of those. Many of the responses were delayed, many of them were misguided, many of them were basically not there where we needed them. So the big question is, what about it? So I wanted to zoom in just at two boxes of the picture that I drew before. So which policy responses? I'm particularly concerned with this identification of risks, challenges, threats, and opportunities, and how people see it. Because let's say, while traveling across Europe, I was frequently confronted with the big question, why is it so that in Greece, migration has not been used in an instrumental way? Why is it so that there is no populism centered around migration? Whereas in contrast, in Hungary there is such a case. So it was very difficult for me to explain it to people, how and why. Of course, there are several reasons that would allow us to explain that. But what I think is missing in the debate and what fuels people's concerns and therefore allows populism thrive is that those intersubjective conceptions, intersubjective feelings that people have are frequently not taken into consideration in the policy-making process. And this takes me very closely to what Dr. Protasevich was talking about, the cities. The cities have been perhaps mostly exposed to the implications of the migration crisis. Of course, solutions were taken at the state level, at the national level. But if you look at Athens, you would have all those people coming in droves to Athens, and solution would be there to be taken by the local authorities. The big question is how. Of course, when migrants arrive, we face two kinds of problems and threats, possibly challenges. We have those people that arrive, be it migrants, be it refugees. They, as human beings, they have their own particular rights, they have their concerns, they have their fears. But in the same way, also, the receiving population, they have similar concerns, they have similar rights, or corresponding rights. The big question is, how do we reconcile them? So in the big discussions I had with my Hungarian colleagues, the question was, so shall we talk about those issues that our population has, or we should not talk about it? I said, of course we have to talk about those issues. Because if you do not take into consideration that the receiving population does have very serious concerns as to, for instance, how our children will go to school, what will be the ratio of the incoming population and the receiving population at school, which will be the language of instruction, and so on and so forth, how we will be living, what the neighborhood will look like in the years to come. Without addressing those issues heads-on, there will never be the possibility of us devising a workable solution. This is why, in the ideal type, what the identification of risks and threats tells us should be very much compliant with what people feel. Because at the end of the day, people are not bad, and this should be something that the policymakers should be taking for granted. It's just that they also want to have the right to express their concerns, fears, etc. So when we go then to the level of analysis issue, well, it has to match also the perception of reality. So this is what I have as well. So this also takes us to the initial point that I had in my highlights about, are we talking about the same, or what is it that we are talking about? So there are several levels through which we can discuss migration, be it micro level, meso level, or macro level. So frequently in the discourse and debate on migration, we basically remain at the macro level. In the best case, we get to the meso level of analysis. But at the end of the day, and this is why I emphasize it, we frequently forget that those people are human beings, are individuals. This is why what you also see, but this is for a different presentation, the issue of agency has been absolutely lost in the debate on migration. This is something that sociologists might want to do, but basically we treat migrants as passive, as policy takers, as those that arrive here without really willing and knowing what they want to do, but this is not the case. So our job is to help them out, regardless of, well, but basically, perhaps because we need to take into consideration how we feel, or our society. Have to have 3 minutes, but I'll be done with it. So my job is so much easier because the issue of cities has been discussed. So if we look at the issue of migration from the meso-level perspective, then basically we are not talking anymore about migration or refugees. We are talking about individuals that need to be helped. And at the city level, what we need to do, we have to offer shelter. We need to help those people be empowered through education, through participation, which is something that we proudly claim is part of our democratic systems. So the basic point here is, and I'll skip those slides, that there's the need to reconcile the short and long-term policy considerations in our debate on migration. So away from politicking towards sustainable solutions. There is also the need to reconcile the intersubjective soft concerns that people have, most probably and more frequently on the receiving society's part. And finally, there is also the need to address such issues that are theoretically or seemingly irreconcilable, such as the challenge of temporary protection and immigration, but this is also for another discussion, immigration policy, and the challenge of moral criticality versus practical feasibility, which takes us back to the big discussion on cities. We may want to receive everyone, we may want to help everyone, but there are very specific, tangible constraints that our urban space faces. So by presenting what I presented, I just wanted to open up the debate and to join my colleagues, and hopefully we'll have a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
I think we have right now more questions than answers, but this also makes good presentation. So we have the last one right now, and you have 2 speakers, but it still means that you have no more than 15 minutes. Yes. Please, Aga Kulesa, who is PhD candidate here at the Warsaw School of Economics and also project manager at the Institute of Public Affairs, and Professor Mikołaj Pawlak, who is assistant professor of sociology at the Institute of Social Prevention and Resocialization at the University of Warsaw, and you will both talk about a super interesting project. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving us the floor, and thank you, Marta, for the invitation. It's my pleasure to, and Mikołaj's pleasure as well, I hope so, to present the project called NIAM. It's a project that has been implemented by the Institute of Public Affairs in Warsaw, together with partners from Poland and also other international partners from 15 other EU member states. Our presentation will be divided into 2 parts. The first one will be about the project backgrounds, and I will introduce this part to you. And the second part will be the floor given to Mikołaj to talk about the most interesting things when it comes to the project. It is the very first results of the research. So when it comes to the project background, and I will be very brief because I think that the presentation will be also made available on the website of the Eumigro project, so that you can take a look at it later at home. The very basic information is that the project was based on the pilot project that was implemented during 2012-2013 together with UNHCR, and the focus was mostly on Central Europe. We were lucky, we got the tool from UNHCR, and we used this tool in order to test it in more countries. So the project started in 2016. It's a 6-year project, and the leader, as I said, is the Institute of Public Affairs in Warsaw. We have strategic partners in Poland, which is, of course, UNHCR, but also the Ministry of Family, Labor and Social Policy, the Ministry of the Interior and Administration in Warsaw, and the University of Warsaw. The main coordinating research partner is Migration Policy Group in Brussels. When it comes to the aims of the project, as the title suggests, we are going to build a mechanism that would allow the policymakers and other interested stakeholders to evaluate the integration policy when it comes to the beneficiaries of international protection. So amongst these 3 bullet points, I would say that the second one and the third one is the most interesting, but they are the core of the project. Wait, not that way. Okay, when it comes to the participants, as I said, we have partners in 15 other EU member states. And as you can see, these are very different partners, starting from universities, through think tanks, to non-governmental organizations. Of course, it doesn't make sense to read them all. You can see that we have also the representation from different countries when it comes to the migration history and the development of migration policies. So the representation is very diverse, I would say. When it comes to the project design, the project has two main components. The first one is, of course, the research component, and within this one we are going to, first of all, build this mechanism that will allow us to evaluate integration policies. My colleague will talk more about the indicators and how this mechanism is being constructed at the moment. What I would like to say is that we will have 3 evaluation rounds, and at the moment we are on the baseline stage. We are going to finish the first evaluation round this year, so the very first results should be available for the whole partnership in autumn this year. When it comes to the second component, it's of course national coalitions and the international coalition. The idea behind national coalitions is to kind of promote the tool that we are constructing at the moment in order to get some support from key stakeholders to use this tool in the future. So as you can see, we have various actors being involved in this coalition building process. We have decision makers, and as I mentioned to you, among the key partners on this Polish grant, there's a Ministry of Family, Labor and Social Policy, of course, and other organizations, but of course academia, civil servants, and non-governmental organizations, but also the beneficiaries of international protection. Now it's time for the most interesting part, so go ahead.
Thank you so much. I will try to present some preliminary results of the first phase of the research in Poland, but because we do not have too much time, and I think it's also interesting to understand the logics behind this research, I would be zooming in a specific part of the research. So first of all, I will start that we are looking for more than 150 indicators of various domains of integration. Yes, housing or employment or residency are important domains of integration, but today I'm going to focus mostly on building bridges and fostering participation, which is very much connected to the theme of this panel, and I think also to the previous presentations, mostly the one by Professor Matusz and Professor Wisfizy. And so among these 14 domains, we are looking now into building bridges and how to measure the building bridges, actually how to conceptualize. What does it mean that receiving society is building bridges between newcomers, and between different actors in the field of that society. So we start with the assumptions taken simply from the common basic principles of integration. But as we all know, the notion of integration and actually this document developed in 2004 are quite fuzzy. So how to operationalize these 3 principles which are describing building bridges and fostering participation? We decided in the frame of the project to use 12 various indicators of these actions between receiving society, its various actors, because it's very important for that project that it thinks about governing the integration,
as a multi-stakeholder collaboration. Yes, of course, it's an evaluation of the state. So the most important message from the project is to the ministries and the state agencies, but the idea behind this research and this view about integration policies is that the state has to facilitate the actions of various level actors, mostly cities, also non-governmental organizations. So some of these indicators are quite straightforward. Yes, we can, for example, we can count how many people received individual mentoring, or how many there are organizations in actions of which there are involved beneficiaries of international protection. But some of them are more complicated, and I will focus only to 4 of them. First, policy indicators. What are the expectations of mutual accommodation by beneficiaries of international protection and host society members? So then we decide to ask that question, and this is the question to what is the situation in Poland, and actually the answer to the question is no. There is no, we cannot say that there is official strategy of putting explicit expectations on the receiving society, because since October 2016 we do not have official integration strategy, so we cannot find it in the strategy, which is not valid. Of course, yeah, there is always a policy without expressed policy document, but we have to answer that question no. In case of the second question raised here, are there any publicly funded campaigns? Yes, they are, but they are founded on ad hoc basis. Yes? So it's also different from not having any campaigns, but also different from having them regularly as a part of a grander policy. These were the indicators from the level of official policy, but it's always interesting to look at the administrative output of policies. So, for example, how the state is coordinating its actions with local authorities and on social cohesion. And this is very interesting because, as especially we saw from the presentation of Professor Matusz Protasiewicz, there is a lot of things going on the city level, but it's not a part of the national strategy. So in that case, we also have to answer, no, we do not have something like this as an element of national state policy, although we see a lot of actions going on. Similarly, with the second indicator about involvement in local consultation process of beneficiaries of international protection. Some way in various cities, they might have been members of these consultations. For example, in case of Warsaw, the organizations who are connected to the refugees or whose members are refugees are able to consult the actions of the city through the Social Dialogue Commission, but it's the development, grassroots level development, we can say. Yes, but the state doesn't bring any framework. We want to have it institutionalized in the level of other local authorities. To conclude the presentation, we could present the challenges, at least from that domain, regarding building bridges in Poland. Some of them, some of these conclusions are quite banal, yes? It's quite conventional knowledge about Polish society that the its civic activities are not very strong. Also, I always look at this as having bad and positive side. We might be very unhappy that in a moment when the Ministry of Interior decided this to cease financing to cease financing from the European Fund of non-governmental organizations. It is proved that many of these organizations are weak enough not to gather its own resources. But on the other hand, we could be happy that actually anti-immigrant organizations are also not very operational in our country. Despite the lack of the state integration policy, there are several examples of good practices on the local level. Yes, and this is very interesting because we cannot notice as an effect of the state policy, but we can see it as something going on, and this is the moment in which this research is meeting with the awareness raising and coalition building. So this is the moment when we try to look something for how to apply the the research findings. From building the examples and the experiences of various cities, for example, we can start thinking what of these actions and local policies could be somehow built in a future frame of the state-level policy. Okay, and that would be all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thanks to all of the speakers for excellent presentation. Now floor is open for your questions. Otherwise, I will ask mine.
No, please, ask the question, because he is going to ask the questions.
So, we have 5 minutes for discussion.
Listening to this presentation from Greece, I was thinking, what you ask, why your society is more open than, for example, our society. It means how practically people treating the foreigners, these refugees, on the streets or anywhere.
I guess we can collect more questions. Yeah, but we can collect more, I guess.
Other questions from the audience? Okay.
I'm a sociologist. If you have 150 indicators, it must be based on very elaborate theory of integration. What is this theory, and what, in your opinion, or in this theory opinion, is the perfect integration? If all the indicators score whatever the highest score possible, okay? What's the perfect integration, and if there are any cases anywhere in the world where they were reached?
Okay, I guess we have space for one more question.
Thank you very much. Katerina Krakhmaleva. I have a question which is related both to second presentation and to the last one, because in both of them have been mentioned some best local practices. So I would be really appreciative of examples of some of those. Thank you.
Perfect. So now it's time for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll be very, very brief. There are two major reasons of why the Greek society is apparently more welcoming. One is very pragmatic, and water is the ultimate barrier. There is no way not to accept those people that arrive. Plus the no pushbacks principle, right? So this defines who will arrive and who will not. So, and then there is the social cultural explanation. Greece has been through several waves of migration. Greece as migrants, internal, the migration within the country, migration to Germany, to the United States, to Australia. So the experience of migration is there. And this wave of migration to Greece is nothing new. Athens in particular has been subjected to waves of migration over the last 40 years. Just the last one, let's say over the period 91, 92, about 1 million of Albanians has arrived, and they have integrated with the society very well. So briefly.
Thank you for the question. I think I can speak for hours giving you the examples, but maybe the best way is to give you example of two projects, CLIP and KING project, which listed good practices from the city level. If I may say just one example, I think that the approach to integration aiming at dialogue between locals and diverse migrants group in the cities we research was very important. So that the financing was also only given to those aiming at dialogue, not about the parallel groups being involved in their own activities, but many cities decided to finance only things aiming at bringing people together. But for more examples, please visit the websites, because then you can find a whole list of good practices from different cities.
Thank you. thank you for this question, and I like it so much because my first love is sociological theory, so we can move this debate to this kind of level. First thing, I have huge theoretical problem with the notion of integration, because actually it's taken from very functionalist vocabulary, saying that society is a kind of a system in which its elements are functioning together and it should be somehow integrated. And in case of this research, which is very much policy-oriented, the problem is that kind of a elaborated theory about what is happening in the society is not only social scientific theory, but it's also, let's say, combined with a kind of a policy theory, or theory what actually policymakers do. So here I would say that this so-called complex theory of integration could be compressed to very, very, very short and very open definition given by Professor Linus Pennings of integration, which means it's a process of becoming acceptable members of society. And what I like in this definition is very open and it's very fuzzy, but it's not limiting integration to it's not limiting thinking about it. Yes, but if because this research is very much policy-oriented, actually, and I was showing in the slide about assumptions behind the indicators, it could be said that common basic principles of integration are kind of a theoretical background of it. This is the expression, what is the idea behind integration. But what is interesting in that case, actually the common basic principles were developed thanks also to the involvement of the research community, and actually Professor Pennings, who gave that super cool definition of integration, was also an inspiration. He was an inspiration, and he works on integration, was inspiration for policymakers. So this is very much entangled. And the second part of the question, what would be the ideal outcome of integration? There is no ideal outcome of integration, because we know that it's the process which is never going to be finished. Yes? So we cannot talk about ideal outcome. Yes? The ideal outcome is actually quite dangerous, because it would make us all being very brought together and very similar. So yes, I would refrain from talking about ideal outcome of the integration process as such, although when we start measuring it, we could set goals of achieving certain outcomes of policies, but in various domains regarding various indicators. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have some housekeeping information? So, we are done. It's time for lunch, if I'm not wrong. Not yet?
Not yet. So this was this housekeeping information. No, we have
lunch, sorry.
Not yet. So now, so I believe that this is the end. No more questions from the audience. So once again, thank you, Paweł, for moderating this session, and thank you all for accepting the invitation and delivering good presentations. Now, only technical shift. So we would like to invite the moderator and speakers of the session number 3. So it will be Dr. Aleksandra Szczerba-Zawada as a moderator, Professor Witold Klaus, Professor Janusz Balicki and Dr. Monika Trojanowska-Strzemboszewska, Dr. Katerina Krak-Lamowa, and Dr. Simon Goodman. So please, 2 minutes for technical change, and after this session you are all invited for our lunch. A good one, I hope.
Pani mówi po polsku. To porozmawiam.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me open the third session of today's extremely interesting conference, during which we will try to find the answer to the question, migration and refugee crisis, cooperation or competition among EU members. In doing this, we will be supported by our outstanding guests, outstanding scientists. Let me introduce them. Professor Witold Klaus, lawyer, criminologist, evaluator, assistant professor in the Institute of Legal Studies of the Polish Academy of Science and Center of Migration Research, University of Warsaw, and at the same time, chair of Association for Legal Intervention. Professor Janusz Balicki and Dr. Monika Trojanowska-Strzemboszewska, who represent Institute of Political Science and Inter-Institutes Migration Research Unit, Colonel Stefan Wyszyński University in Warsaw. Dr. Katarzyna Krachmalowa. She holds bachelor and specialist degrees in law with honors, LLM in human rights, and PhD in law. She represents International Law Department, National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy. And last but not least, Dr. Simon Goodman. He is a research fellow in psychology at Coventry University. In his research, exploring the discursive construction of asylum seekers and refugees, he focuses on the ways in which potentially prejudicial arguments against asylum seekers can be and are rationalized. But before giving the floor to our panelists, please let me outline briefly the legal context of the member states' obligation towards the EU and one another when dealing with migration crisis. When taking into account the treaty provisions, the answer to the title question is simple and obvious: solidarity first. The EU treaties refers to solidarity principle in numerous political contexts, in numerous legal contexts. It has been recognized as a guiding principle of the member state societies in Article 2 TEU. It is also one of the EU IAMs listed in Article 3 TEU. It has been also acknowledged by Article 4.3 TEU that stipulates the principle of sincere cooperation that requires member states to adapt all necessary, all appropriate measures in order to assure that the obligation arising out of EU law are fulfilled. This is particularly important in these policies where the EU cannot act on its own, as these policies do not fall under its scope of exclusive competencies. And this is the case of policy of asylum and immigration. Suffice to say that also with respect to this policy, the solidarity is the founding principle. Treaty makes it clear that both at the stage of formulating and implementation of this policy, this should be done in accordance with the solidarity principle and the fair sharing of responsibility, including financial implications between member states. Article 80 TFEU adds to this that when the EU adapts legal acts within this policy, they should enshrine or envisage the measures created in order to give effect to the solidarity principle. And taking into account this
wide scope of application of solidarity, requirement of solidarity in the light of these two articles, we can say that the solidarity principle is the fundamental principle that defines the way the member states should act towards one another and towards the EU when dealing with the migration issues. But this is the theory. Let's now investigate the reality. Professor Witold Klaus, could you be so kind to start our discussion with outlining the attitude of the EU and member states in solving refugee crisis?
Tutaj są otwarte.
Hello, thank you for the invitation. I would like to briefly present you some dilemma between or discrepancy between security and humanitarian approach when it comes to, let's say, solving refugee crisis or dealing with refugees and asylum seekers. But firstly, I would like to say our keynote speakers at the beginning, which both were excellent, and I would like to build on what it was said previously. So starting with security. Security agenda was introduced within the EU in early 1990s, and it is the thing that that we could find cooperation between all EU member states and solidarity within it, because it is rather agreed that security is the first issue when it comes to migration, when it comes to dealing with asylum seekers or refugees. It is because of fear of immigrants, because of fear of later on Islamist terrorists, especially after 9/11. It was another term was added. It was constantly fueled and created by politicians with gain from this discourse. This is discourse when we as Europeans should defend ourselves from some kind of invasion from the others, from culturally distant peoples, and it comes to this triad as immigrant and asylum seekers equals Muslims equals terrorists. That's why immigrants equal terrorists. So to make it very simple. So the question is, it's solidarity not with whom, but against whom. And the solution that our politicians found out is closing the borders, sealing Europe, and it's made through using different tools, starting with law. The migration law became stricter and stricter, and it's really difficult to find legal ways of arrival, despite that what our profound speakers said in previous session in big words that Europe should be open and should find legal ways. Nothing has been done yet, and nothing has prepared to be done in this matter. Then it follows by physical barriers, starting with fences, which is quite mostly common. With electronic assistance and developing surveillance, especially on maritime border, which is very present. And the idea behind this is to pushing refugees away from our territory, or even more, as the idea of border proliferation says, it's like not allowing them even to be close to our territory. So let's make others responsible for preventing ourselves from refugees. Other countries, especially nowadays, it's the EU-Turkey agreement is one example. The other is number of agreements which was named earlier between EU or separate EU countries with Northern American countries, Northern African countries. Sorry, not American. So we prevent ourselves from refugees, and we push this idea of prevention or this burden of prevention towards or to poorer countries which violate human rights, and we turn blind eye on it very easily. So the question is there humanity there? What about what we are doing? And by we, I think I mean we as a European community, as member states, as EU citizens, as all, because this is very complex. And I will start with the term vulnerability, which was brought to your attention with, I mean, in the presentation of Frontex. The Frontex twisted the idea of vulnerability. It's no longer people who are vulnerable. It's the borders that are vulnerable. So, and Frontex offers vulnerability assistance towards borders, not people that trying to cross them and dying crossing them. There we have criminalization of solidarity in number of examples. Sorry. Starting with blaming NGOs, search and rescue missions for their collusion with traffickers, which is the discourse developed by Frontex, by some leader politicians. It's followed by the idea that Hungarian government came up with this anti-Soros legislation package to prevent NGOs from helping migrants at all, because those NGO madness must be stopped. And behind this madness, I mean saving people from drowning, saving people, delivering people with some food. When it's not enough, member states are very keen to punish NGO activists or common citizens that have decency and offer their assistance to refugees. Well, it's very easy to make them responsible for illegal smuggling while they are offering a lift for asylum seekers, or assist or responsible for assistance with illegal stay where they offer them shelter in their own homes. And there is a number of this kind of situation revealed in a quite recent report by Institute of Race Relations. And this kind of behavior performed by government is supported by kind of part of the society, because those behaviors taken by NGO activists are unpatriotic. So is it racist? Should we call it racism? This kind of behavior. There was a question asked in previous panel: should we allow people express their concerns or threats against migrants? Yes, we should, and we could. But the question is how and why, and in which words. And when it comes to this program, this quote from last month. By Viktor Orban, when someone don't want to be mixed with or don't want to allow our color to be mixed with others, is it racist? should we call it racist, or should we call should we rename it as it's maybe it's reasonable, accepted, and legitimate statement by alternative rights representative, or as they call themselves, identitarians. But in my opinion, and it's very nice and very brave, in my opinion, response to to Viktor Orban by UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Al-Hussein, who said it is racist. I mean, he just named the elephant in the room and showed that some kind of statement are racist, and we should name it as racist. Because what identitarians try to do is they try to make racism modern and fashionable. We call it new racism, and as Ibrahim said, the new racism and the face of new racism is when we link immigrants to and with cultural difference that threaten our way of life, and this kind of attitudes should be and could be and should be named as racist. So who is the savior? Who could save us? And there is not a positive answer in my opinion. I am quite pessimistic. Because usually the savior should be courts. We can't seek support in society, in politicians, so maybe courts. And courts has to, used to play the very positive role in the past as a human rights protector, not allowing governments do whatever they wanted. But now the role of courts is more ambivalent, and especially when you take a look at two quite recent judgments of the Court of Justice of the European Union, which do not support human rights at all, which make very clear difference between us, Europeans who deserve for some rights, and the others who try to reach our borders, and we could deny them then to do so. Of course, it is done very nicely, not in racist way. They found a number of technicalities not to answer positive the question: is EU-Turkey agreement invalid, because it should be invalid as a violation of human rights? Should we issue humanitarian visas as a government to people in need? I mean, there is not. I mean, the question theoretically is obvious, but it's not. And so, what about domestic courts? And again, we have very mixed feeling, especially being in Poland and seeing the change within all judiciary system. I am again quite pessimistic, but those punishments that I talked to you about previously happened, and the court issued some sentences towards very humanitarian attitudes. So, should we count our courts? I have number of doubts about it. Why? Because as Bowman anticipated years ago, actually, we found the scapegoat, the people that we could blame for everything, and we could feel better about it, and we are very keen to accept any inhuman actions, any inhumanitarian actions, any actions that are against human rights to prevent those others being here with us in our home. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the time limit and the observance of the time regime we were supposed to do. And now the time